Today we're going to be swapping out the gas tank on this 1968 Camaro. Now the original gas tank on the left was there to support the current engine that's in this car, which is a straight six 250 that's carbureted and it's got a manual fuel pump. This car will be going through a restoration and getting an EFI style engine in the future, so I didn't want to replace the tank with the original style, but what I'm going to do is put in a EFI style tank that you see on the right. And so we're going to take this tank out as well as then retrofit that the new EFI tank to fit this current engine, and then we'll finally do an install of that new tank. Well, let's get started. Alright, we're going to start the tank removal process by actually draining the gas. I think the last time I drove this, I actually filled it up, probably 15 gallons of gas, and that's where I actually saw the leak. So I think we're gonna, just to help making lowering the gas tanks, we don't have to manhandle it so bad, is if we can just siphon out some of the gas now, it's just gonna help that process. Interestingly though, this has got a, you can't just drop a siphon hose down in here because there's a spring and it actually is closed down there. Siphon hose won't fit down in there, but so I'm going to take off these bolts and we're going to try and get this assembly and the filler neck off, and that way we can, I think if I get these bolts and get this off the filler neck, I might be able to get this spring out of here and then we can siphon it. Okay, so it's hung on the filler tube. Now to get to the filler tube, easiest way, there's a big hole behind this license plate. So. Alright, so inside the trunk there's also this little cover that's covering the gas filler neck as well. I'm going to go ahead and take that off and see what's under that. Just make sure we got everything, just this one little bolt. Get a soft boot and then the actual filler tube underneath there. There's 4 more bolts right here to get this bottom of that bracket off. Let's get those off too. Okay, so that loosens that boot up. So now I think we're going to go back down through this access hole behind the license plate. There's a hose clamp. Basically just take that loose and should be able to maybe pull some of this stuff up and then we can start draining gas. So here's this little access hole behind the license plate. There's 2 hose clamps right there. I'm going to get those taken out, and I think that's going to allow us to wiggle that thing loose. Okay, so now if we just pull with those 2 hose clamps loose, we pull that loose, and this. Now see, oh, there we go. There's my filler neck. And then this guy is going to pull it out this way. That's just a protective boot, I guess, keep back fumes or something outside of the trunk. That's probably what it does. And then this guy, I thought this might come apart where I can get that spring out, but I can't. So we're going to leave that alone. Now we're going to be able to get into this hole and siphon the gas. Alright, the next part of the process requires you to take off the rear passenger tire. So we went ahead and jacked up the rear end and put it on jack stands. Got the front wheels chalked. Jack stands are holding up the rear axle, and you basically got to come up in this wheel well. And I'm going to take it's kind of dark in there. I'm going to take a picture and show you that you need to remove this one ground wire that's mounted right here, and then also you're going to remove, I'm going to go ahead and cut off this fuel line, and I'm going to replace all this soft fuel line with new fuel line. If that stuff gets a crack in it, it's kind of like drinking out of a straw with a little crack in it. It just doesn't suck. So we're going to replace the soft fuel line as well. So let me get those two things taken care of, and then we'll be ready to remove the tank. Okay, I think there's two more quick steps we got to do, and we'll be dropping the tank. One is to remove the straps, and then secondly, I still believe there's a sending unit wire that we're going to have to deal with. So we're going to loosen both of the straps and then lower the tank, and then carefully, and then monitor for that extra electrical wire, which we should be able to get to once we kind of lower it some. And then so there's some bolts. They are 9/16 nuts on a big long threaded rod, and those bolts, let me show you where those are. There's one on right here behind the panel, and then another one right there. We're going to reach up under there and start loosening those. I've got the jack stand is actually supporting the tank, so once we get these straps loosened and pulled out of the way, we'll slowly monitor and lower that tank. Alright, so we got those nuts off of these. Here's one of the straps. We should be able to just pull these straps down and off. We'll bend those out of the way. And then if you want to start slowly. Okay. Okay, so I was right. Here's this the sending unit wire, and it's long enough. It gave us enough space to drop the tank and pull it out from under the car. And it's just looks. This is a connector of some sort. So there, yeah. Okay, so that's perfect. And now the tank is completely free. All right, we're ready to start retrofitting this tank, the new tank, to fit into that car. Again, I bought the EFI version of this tank. The tank shape is exactly like the old one, just has a different section here in the middle with the two holes, makes it an EFI tank. Again, for my situation, I'm putting an EFI tank into an original Camaro with an original engine. It's got the carburetor and the manual fuel pump, but I'm going to retrofit this to fit that because that car will be getting a new engine in it that is EFI. So I went ahead and did the upgrade now. But this kit, this is a kit, I bought it from Summit. It's from Tanks Inc. And it came with the actual tank, which has got like a really nice silver powder coating on it, as well as this is the sending unit. This is a 0 to 90 ohm sending unit, which is made for almost General Motors products of that era. Gasket and screws. It also came with another little kit here that it's the fuel pump assembly kit. It's got the fuel pump, this portion here that goes down in the tank, as well as a Walboro pump. This is the GSS 340G3 pump. It's got the isolator for it. Came with a rollover valve. Came with, this is the for the vent. This is a splitter for the vent, because we actually got a vent on the tank and a vent in the top of this fuel pump assembly, so we need to do that. It did come with a sock, but I'll show you something here in a minute on that. It came with, this kit came with gaskets and screws for both the fuel pump assembly and the sending unit assembly. So we actually got double of this. I think I'll probably use these cork ones. And it also, the kit came with these straps. This is two straps, they're still kind of attached together. But so that's what this kit came with. And before I'm about to move this off the table and put together kind of an overview of all the other stuff that I bought. But before I do that, I know that I'm going to need, before I take this tank down, I'm going to need a couple measurements. And that is from the bottom of the tank to the top surface of both of these holes. I'm assuming they're going to be the same, but let's take a peek. That one is 6.5. And interesting, that's 6 3/8. So we'll make a note of those, and I'll show you how that comes into play in just a minute. But let me now move this stuff out of the way and kind of show you some of the other things that I had to buy. And here are the other items that I could think of right off the bat that I've already purchased. And you know, one is, I know that my kit did not come with a filler neck, so I went ahead and bought a filler neck to replace. Also, I wanted to definitely get a new interface. This is interfaces between the filler neck and the tank. Went and bought some clamps for that. I bought a different sock. I'll go over the details of that when we start working on the fuel pump assembly section. Why this was different, why I thought this might work. I hope it does. This is PTFE tape, so it's good for fuel. Thread tape. On the top of that fuel tank, fuel pump assembly, we're going to need a couple of these two fittings. This is from Summit Racing. It's tank straps, so that's going to be the anti-squeak we're going to put on the tank, and probably have enough to put on the straps as well. Went in and bought, this is a 5/16 inch fuel line. I bought a 3-foot section, then also another 2-foot section for the vent line and for some fuel stuff, and then some hose clamps where they're going to be needed. So let's, this was the additional things. Now I'm going to put all this, I've got all this stuff in an Excel spreadsheet. I'm going to print it to a PDF file. It'll be available, you know, underneath this video. You can download for free, print it, use it as a reference. You may need to change some things for your particular application, but other than that, you know, it's a good reference instead of trying to write all these part numbers down. I'm going to get this stuff cleared off. We're going to actually start with the sending unit. Let's get that thing all situated and then get it prepared to be put in the tank. All right, we're going to start with this fuel sending unit, and for tanks that have a depth of between 6 and 15.5 inches, they want us to remove this lower bracket. There's actually 2 brackets here. They got this big sliding area. There's a lot of adjustment, but this is just too long for that. So we're going to take this bracket off. Ultimately, the rheostat comes off the lower bracket. The lower bracket comes off this upper bracket, and then we're going to put the rheostat back on the upper bracket. So let me get that all done, and then we'll bring it back. Okay, so we've taken this bracket off. Here's that extra bracket. The rheostat was attached to this. We took it off, right? Here's all the screws for that. And then the instructions say if your tank is between 6 and 7 inches, you don't need this top screw up here, because ultimately we're going to get above, I guess, this adjustment piece. And so here's the top screw. I've left it off. And it's really important, though, that you also orientate this like it was, and you put this on this side. If you 180 this and put it on the back side, your float is going to be on the opposite side, and it's not going to work right. So you need to make sure this is like this, and this assembly is on the upside so that it looks like this. So now what we want to do is, the instructions now say you take half of the tank height, which in our case was 6.5 inches. Take half of that, that's 3.25 inches, and then we're going to add 1/8 of an inch for the thickness of this gasket that's going to be right here. So that's 3 3/8. And so we're going to come up here to 3, and that's the distance between this surface and the center line of this pivot point. So we're going to take this and move this up until we get to 3 3/8 right there. And then I'm just going to mark underneath here. All right, so that's the depth of that, and now we need to take this off because they want us to cut this bracket off, and they basically, there's a note on there that says don't do it with this rheostat on here because you don't want to get a bunch of shavings and stuff in there. So we're going to take this thing back apart and get that cut off, and let me put that back where that was. It says we want it at the lowest point, so realistically I could cut it off. I'm going to cut it off at that line, because we'll be screwing it tight over here. Yeah, I'm just going to cut it off at that line. So let me get that cut off, and I'll show you what that looks like. All right, next we're going to take this little pin here. This is just a temporary pin. We're going to take this out and replace it with this our float assembly. So we take this, just make it loose, pull that out, push this in, and then they want us to either use the gasket or use a gasket allowance. I think it's going to be easier to use the gasket, and put it in the full up position, and then bring this thing down until it's even with the top of this. So let's see how we can do this. Something like that. think I'm going to have to sneak up on it. Put a little attention on that. Pushing this out until we get, it's got to be down, it's got to be touching here, and then right there, right there. Let me tighten that down and then we'll double check it. That's it. Okay, I don't know if you can see it, but I got, that's perfect there. Alright, and then the next thing we do is we want to just trim this off. You got to trim it off just past this little flange, because this is the stop for it, up and down. So what if we just trimmed it off like right here? We'll cut that off right there. Alright, so here's our finished product. We got that trimmed off with just a simple hacksaw, metal hacksaw, and it's just a little bit longer than that gauge there. Now these little tabs, I know that when you buy these where they're specific for a vehicle, I know you can use and bend these tabs, and we've actually bent this one to try and get this to read a little bit better. But again, this is a 0 to 90 ohm item, so if I put it like the tank is full and we put the terminals on there, we get 90.2, 90.1, so there's full tank. And then if I drop this ball down, 1.3, 1.2, that's kind of the lowest we can get. That's after adjusting that, but that's going to be perfect for this. So you know, that's how this, as the fuel goes up, you get more ohms, and as it goes down, you go down to 0 ohms, and that's the signal that's going to get sent to the fuel gauge up front. So this thing's ready. We're going to put this to the side, and then we're going to start working on the fuel pump assembly. Alright, so here's the fuel pump assembly, and before I go hack on this and create my custom solution, I think it's kind of important to understand what this would look like if I was to set this up as an EFI style assembly, because I'm going to have to do that in the future, and I just want to make sure I'm not damaging something and I can actually do an alteration on it down the road. So you know, these are clearly labeled. This has got an S on it, and this has got a R for return, so supply. Basically, you would mount the sock on the pump like this. You take a measurement from the bottom of the sock up to the bottom of this little section here, and you take that measurement and you subtract it from that tank depth measurement we had, which was 6 3/8. And we'd come up here, somewhere up in here, we would cut this off, and then we would slide this on there and then put a hose clamp on it. And that's how you'd mount the pump. Now you do need to also make sure, don't forget when you're doing these measurements, to also take an allowance for this gasket. Otherwise you're going to end up being a little bit short on the short side, and your sock won't be sitting on the bottom of the tank. But this is the supply line, and then this other line is the return. This is where in an EFI system, the system is pressurized and excess gas actually gets returned back to the tank. And so this actually, according to the instructions, you'd come to the tank depth minus 1 inch, and then you cut it off at a 45-degree angle, and that's where it's going to return the fuel. Now, we're not going to need one of these two. We're not going to install the pump or this sock. Now, this sock, I think I'd seen a picture of this in the diagrams of the assembly, and realized this had this larger hole so it fit this pump. And knowing that wouldn't help me at all, I went ahead and ordered and bought this. It's a GM-based fuel filter sock that goes in the bottom of a tank, and it's got a hole that's closer to what we're looking for. Now, unfortunately, this hole is too big for this white tube. It's got a lot of slop, and it's too small for this black tube. So I've got a choice. I'm gonna use one of these two lines. The other line I'm gonna disable. I got a choice of either trying to fatten this up somehow, you know, heat it up and expand it maybe, or I think it'd be easier. This is a very thick wall thickness tube, and I think I'm going to try and sand down the perimeter of this and get it small enough where this will slip on there. And then I've bought some adhesive and sealant that is oil and gas tolerant, and we'll be able to glue that together. And then ultimately we'll make sure it's the right depth, right? So I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to try this first. I'm going to take this we don't need. I'm going to take this off, just pull it out of this black tube, leave this black tube, and then I'm actually going to, for this port up here, I'm actually going to block that off. I bought this, just a plug for that. And then for this supply line, we're going to convert it for my engine. We're going to convert it over to a barb. And that way I can just run a rubber hose from this barb to the connection that's already there in the car. So let's go ahead and start. I'm going to get this off, and then I'm going to go ahead and take this off because I'm going to chalk this up in my drill press so I can spin it. That way I can use some sandpaper and just slowly take it down till we get the right size. So let's get all that set up and let's see if we can get this where we'll fit. All right, I got this tapered down just like I wanted, and now fits on the sock. It's not easy to sand. This is just plastic, but it doesn't like to sand, and if you get it too hot, it's gonna melt. You'll notice I left the whole thing long, and I went ahead and worked on it. If I messed it up, I can just cut it off and try again, and cut it off, try again, keep going until I got something I liked. This was the first go around, but let me tell you, it took a long time. I did chalk this up in my drill press, and with some 80 grit sandpaper, I think it was 80 or 60, I went at it for 20 minutes and barely budged it based on the micrometer. So I ended up taking just a real sharp razor blade and just slightly just taking off it, the smallest sliver as I rotated it around. I ended up having to go around it twice. Then I'd re-chalked it back up and then used the sandpaper to kind of smooth it out. But it's still got plenty of thickness on the wall. I'll show a close-up of the way that looks, as well as the way this sock works. You know, fuel comes in through this mesh here, and it enters. There's a very small gap right there where it enters into this chamber, and I actually ended up notching this out, and I'll match that up with that chamber so that gas will come from the sock and come up and be able to get up in here. I'm gonna go ahead and now glue this in. This is that sealant that I told you that I found. It's made by Loctite, oil and gas resistant. It's an adhesive, so it's like a glue, and it's a sealant, almost like a gasket sealer. So I'm gonna use this probably on my gaskets as well. But I'm gonna get this out and go ahead and get this kind of put together, and then ultimately let it dry, probably overnight. I just don't want to get it messed up. So let me get all that put together and I'll show you what it looks like. All right, there it is. Got it very well sealed. Like I said, I'm gonna let that dry, and then we'll take a measurement and we'll get this thing cut to final length, and we'll get it installed back on our bracket here. So, all right, this thing has now hardened, and it's got a nice. First of all, it's a nice interference type fit, and then that glue, not only down in the joint, but I did glue that seam. You don't want the little crack or it won't suck gas. That's pretty cool. Before I install that, I got to cut it off, but before I install that on here, I did go ahead last night and I glued on these gaskets, both on this assembly as well as this sending unit assembly, just to have that where it's in contact. So I had a little bit of camera issues, but I didn't want to leave out this important step, so I'm just going to walk you through what I did next. And I thought it was going to be the easiest to go ahead and get the fittings on the top side of this bracket installed next. So I went ahead and used that PTFE yellow tape and wrapped it around the threads. I installed the plug on that return side, and then I installed the fitting with the barbed end on the supply line and got the top end of this little bracket, the fuel assembly, got that all situated. The next thing I did was I did go ahead and cut off that black tube that was attached to the filter. And in my case, my tank again is 6 3/8 inch deep. But this bracket is going to sit on top of a gasket. But I want the tube to go all the way up to the bottom of the bracket. So I took my tank depth and I added the thickness of the bracket. So that's 6 3/8 inches plus 1/8 of an inch gives me 6 1/2 inches. So I just took that the sock and the tube and set it on the table and measured up, marked off 6 1/2 inches, cut that off. And then in order to install that, the best way to do it, and it looked like it's the way they did it from the factory, was I actually used a heat gun and heated up that end of the tube to and it takes a lot of heat, but to put a lot of heat, just kind of soften it up a little bit, and then was able to easily push it onto that barb fitting. And don't forget your hose clamp. Now I didn't clamp this down tight because here in a little bit we're going to talk about how we need to clock that sock to make sure it's not hitting an internal baffle to the tank. So let's go see what we're doing next. All right, let's start with that sending unit. It's going to go in just like this. There is a baffle right here, so the ball's got to go on this side. And again, the fact that we oriented this just right is going to make it fit that way anyway, because this thing actually is clocked. The distance between these two holes is longer than the distance between any of these other holes. This is like an inch, an inch, an inch, an inch, and this is like an inch and a quarter. So that gasket, you got to clock that gasket. It actually has a little divot right there in it, but anyway. So anyway, this is going to sit right down in there. I'm going to go ahead and get some juice on here, a little bit of glue, and then we'll be ready to stick it in there. All right. Alright, that's that one. And then same considerations for this. There is, I can look down here with a flashlight, there's a baffle here. There's actually a baffle across here. And there's one out here and one way out here. So I need this sock to either go this way or this way. I do want these lines coming, actually I'd like to clock it. Oh, probably there. So I'm going to rotate this sock. I'm going to put it going straight toward the front. That'd be the rear of the vehicle. Let's do that. So I'm going to tighten this down first. I'll put my goop on there with the bolts already on there. Okay, got those installed. One other thing I've got to do to this piece here is there's two holes where when you have the fuel pump down in there, there's two wires that come out through here, and there's a physical hole here. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off just a 1-inch piece of that wire and go ahead and stick it down in here and wrench that down just to close these 2 holes. I've clocked this one particularly because I want my supply line pointing toward the passenger side of the vehicle. Just off the edge of the tank is the hard line, the gas hard line coming from the engine bay. It just terminates over there, so I just need to go about 2 feet and I'll be able to tap into that. And that'll be that done. We do have 2 vents. This unit, being a universal unit, has a vent in it, and then Tanks Inc. actually puts a vent. It's in the highest part of the tank, and so they provide us a little splitter. We're gonna join this together, and then let's do that first, and then let's talk about this rollover valve. All right, we got our vent lines extended and merged into this splitter that was provided with the kit. So we got all that done, and we actually went ahead and put on a fuel line. It's a 3-foot piece of fuel line onto the fuel connection. And then there's another hose I need to put onto this splitter, and it goes out and ultimately terminates into this. This is a vent / rollover valve. And what this does, it has to be mounted vertically like this. And in the vertical position, air can freely go in and out of this. So if you parked in a parking lot and the gas in the tank got a little bit warm and it started expanding, it can escape through this, as well as you use and consume fuel and get gases coming out of the tank, it's got that volume's got to be replaced with air, so air actually goes back into the tank, so it's freely in and out. And that's the vent part of this valve. The valve also has a little ball in it, and in this upright position it's free flowing in and out, but as soon as you go 90 degrees from here all the way around to the other 90 degrees, that ball drops down and it blocks the port. And if you blow or suck on this, or actually if you blow on it, you can't. It blocks it. So, and what that does, if the car rolls over and it's upside down, gas won't be. Because since we're at, if it's upside down, this is now the lowest part of the tank, and gas would just free flow out of this thing. So anyway, that's what this is for. The problem is where to locate this. On a first gen Camaro, specifically that I've been thinking about, there really isn't a place. They want this mounted vertically. They also want it mounted where this opening is higher than the gas filler, the top of the gas filler neck. Well, on this vehicle, there really isn't. I've got a question out on the Camaro forums forum to see if anyone has got a recommendation there. I actually emailed Tanks Inc. and they got back to me really with a generic, kind of restating the rules and stuff, but it didn't really tell me specifically on a Camaro where you would mount this. Well, guess what? I think I've left them speechless. I'm going to put up a copy of the message that I put out on Camaro forums. It was very well thought out, no misspellings. I showered before I wrote it. Everything seemed to be fine. It's been sitting there for several weeks, and 173 people have viewed this question and no responses. I think people are not willing to commit to an answer because there's not really a good answer. Now because of this, I did go out on some other forums and found where there were several times where people asked several questions, including this one. All the other questions got answered except for where to place this vent valve. But there was one guy that finally stuck his neck out, and he said he put it on the frame rail, on the inside of the frame rail, on the passenger side, back near the rear wheel. So, in that little arch spot. So, let's go take a look at that. I think we'll be able to find a spot there. He says it hasn't given him any problems, so I'm willing to do that because again, it's not a permanent fix. It's just it's a place to put it. If I seem to have some problems, I can always move it. So, let's go take a look. Okay, so here's the passenger side rear axle. I took the tire off, obviously, and you can see right here's the frame and the kind of the highest part of the frame within this space. And the suggestion is putting it on the back side or the inside of that. Now, unfortunately, when I reach in there and feel there's actually about 1.5 inches up. There's the hard fuel line, so I got to take a consideration for that. And I don't want to mount it directly over the axle because the way the thing hangs down, if the axle goes up, it could bump it and mess it up. I'm actually going to scoot it back toward the rear of the car, maybe 1 inch or 2, and put it about right here, but on the inside. So let me take some measurements of this little space, and then we'll work out some kind of bracket so we can get that thing mounted there. All right, so I think this is kind of the fun part. So I took some measurements, and the frame rail itself is 3 inches tall and 1 3/4 inches wide. So I got that drawn on, and then I put basically the ceiling of where it was. Then the next thing I did is kind of measured up that vent valve and got it kind of positioned where I wanted it in the drawing, taking consideration of that existing hard fuel line. And then I just kind of sketched in a bracket, and you'll notice in this version of the bracket, the vent valve sits on it, gets mounted to it, it comes down and actually gets then mounted or bolted to the bottom of the frame rail. And that was my first thinking, and I even actually then took a profile at the very bottom of this picture, took a profile of what that frame rail looked like. I just held the sheet of paper behind it and traced the frame rail, and then kind of those two vertical lines kind of indicate kind of where on that curve I wanted to mount this thing, because I had to capture that angle there because it would be in consideration when I bent one of these angles. But I then kind of later realized, that for some reason that bracket just looks like it might flex a little bit too much, and I just wanted a little more stiff bracket. So then I in looking at that, I actually then came down to the bottom and I just did a real quick isometric type sketch of a different bracket. Again, it's still got a hole in it there where the vent valve would be mounted. It has a pretty long distance over to take consideration for that fuel line, but then it mounts to the side of the frame rail. And so I did like this design a lot better. I think it's a stiffer bracket, and it would allow us to create something I think that would last and not get damaged in any way. So this is what I kind of set out to build. The next step would be to take this isometric drawing and kind of flatten it out. In other words, what would the shape look like if I cut it out of a flat piece of metal before I bent it? So in looking at the isometric drawing and realizing all my measurements, I came up with this diagram. The dotted lines are going to be my bends, and then you can see where I later on just added notes that I wanted to round the corners just to make it look a little better or whatever. The odd piece that you'll see here that's not really relevant in the isometric is the little triangle piece up at the top center. That's going to get bent down, and once that top flange gets bent down, it's going to create kind of like a built-in gusset, and I'll put a little spot weld on that just to make this thing. It's going to be super stiff, and it doesn't have to be, but I just want to make it kind of right. So this was the final design here. I ended up taking a photocopy of this and cutting it out with scissors, put it on a piece of sheet metal. Pretty sure I used 16 gauge. I was thinking that the big sheet I have is 18 gauge, but I ended up finding a little small piece of 16 gauge that even made this even more stiff. But got this string drawn out, got it cut out, folded up and welded, and then we came out with this finished product. Alright, so how does that look? There's my kind of like that isometric drawing that you saw. Looks just like that. This will be 2 holes that gets mounted to the inside of the frame rail. Vent valve goes in there. And here's where I bent down that triangle and then just tack welded it on the inside. And I've primed this and spray painted it flat black. I'm going to mount the vent valve, and I'm going to get this mounted in there. I'm not going to do that on camera. It's just too tight. I think I've covered pretty well where this is going to go. So we'll drop that. I'm going to get that done. And then we do have a couple more things we got to do here on the tank. I have added another piece of this 5/16 inch fuel line to extend my valve, because now that I knew where it was, I knew how much of this tubing to buy. I think overall, I've got a 3-foot piece currently on this. It'll get actually probably cut down to 2.5. This is about 3 feet. Maybe 3 feet, 3 feet, that's 6, and then here's some more here. So if you end up buying 7 feet of this 5/16 fuel line, I think it would be enough to cover this project. And I don't know if we can zoom in here a little bit, but here you can see where I got those wires stuffed down in here and got those tightened down so that won't leak at all there. Got that plugged up. So the next thing I want to do or to show and talk about is I've got to add a small little harness, a grounding harness. This sending unit needs to be grounded just like the other one was. as well as the instructions talk about you need to have the tank grounded. So I'll go ahead and honor that as well. I'm going to create basically a grounding wire that comes and mounts to the frame where it did earlier with the other tank, but it's going to come down and it's going to come to the sending unit as well as split off, and I'm going to tie it into one of these bolts. So let me get that built real quick and then we'll get that installed. Alright, so here's what I came up with. I believe this is 16 gauge wire. Anyway, this will go to the body. This end will go to the body. This end here will go to ground the sending unit, and then this is going to flip over here and go and get mounted onto that. So because I'll make sure it's touching the bolt which is screwed into the tank, which basically grounds the tank. And on this side, I want to make sure that I don't care about grounding the tank. I just make sure that this is in good contact with this bolt here, as well as the centerpiece is where on the sending unit wiring coming from the fuel gauge itself, which is in the wiring harness of the car, it's going to go on here. I got a nut on here. I'll probably just take that off because I think it's like a push, almost like a push nut is what that's on the end of that curt wire. And if that doesn't work, I'll redo it and put a little loop and get it tied in here. But I think if I can, I'll just take this little nut off and we'll just use that push style and get that done there. So let me get this mounted real quick and then I'll show you what that looks like. Alright, here's a final look at this little section here. I did get the grounding strap that I made. I got it bolted. It's connected to the ground here, which grounds our sending unit, as well as this bolt grounds the tank, and then it runs out this direction to be attached to the car. So this section is now complete. We got one last little thing we got to do to this tank before we're ready to install, and that is to put some anti-squeak straps on the top of this. So we're going to get those glued on with some spray trim adhesive, and let's get that taped up and get that done next. Alright, using Permatex all-purpose spray adhesive. I used this on my Jeep project and I really liked it. It bonded really well, so we're going to try and use it here as well. Alright, so that should finish up the tank. I think we're ready really to install it back in the car. The top of the tank gets these anti-squeak straps, as well as the straps that hold the top of the straps that hold the tank in the car. They'd also got this exact same treatment. So with all that, I think we're ready now to put this back in the car and get it strapped in. Alright, so we're tightening this up manually with a ratchet so that we can kind of determine how tight it's getting, because that actual band's got to kind of change shape So I think, you think that's good?
Yeah.
You got that good? All right, let's go move to the other side, and that'll finish up getting this thing bolted in. All right, so that last little clip was us getting the tank all secured into place. After that, we made 4 physical connections. One was the actual sending unit sensor wire, which ultimately comes right through here. We got that attached. We got the ground attached underneath. We got the vet line attached, and we got the fuel line attached. So now we're done underneath the car. Now we've got, we went ahead and put in a new collar here that interfaces between the tank and the filler tube. I bought a brand new filler tube. Get this filler tube, and this is a little soft boot that's just basically a vapor barrier, I believe. We'll get that put in, and we'll cover it. We'll be done. Alright, the last thing we did was tighten down those hose clamps on that filler neck. So now everything is in place. We're going to fill it with gas and see if we can get it to run. So it's actually been a couple months since I made that repair, but everything is holding up fine. We've driven the car quite a bit, and it works flawlessly. So that whole plan, I guess, worked. You know, I needed to replace that tank because it did have a leak. And again, I wanted to go to the EFI style tank because this car is going to ultimately get an EFI style engine, and there's no reason to buy the direct replace it and then upgrade it again later. And it's easier just to do it this way, I think. So anyway, it worked flawlessly. This was one of a few upgrades that I made to this old girl because my oldest son was getting married, and one of the requests, they wanted to drive away from the wedding in this. So there's a few safety issues and things like that that I wanted to take care of. This was just one of them. So I'm also have a quick video on I installed a rear spoiler, which this car ultimately was going to get anyway, as well as a front spoiler. And then I did a little work in the engine bay and stuff and lighting and all, but I'll probably put a 4th video together that quickly summarizes a bunch of little stuff and of what we did to that. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. You stayed around this long. I thought I'd also just throw in a little clip of them driving away. So I hope you take care, and we'll see you next time.